Hello, my friends. This is going to be the story of the second vampire campaign I ran. I mean, it's like the third or fourth actually, but the second vampire campaign I ran after my big 2-year campaign, and then the year in which I ran 3 kind of abortive games. We ran Midnight Heat. This was a game that I would say was pretty successful, although it had some weird things that happened in it. The initial premise of the game was that the players were all going to be like outcast loser vampires, right? Who were rounded up in LA, and basically they're told, you guys are a bunch of fuck-ups. So rather than kill you, we're gonna kick you the fuck out of here up north to the desert, where it's kind of a disaster.
I've got an idea. Why don't you little religious weirdos get in a leaky, rickety little boat and get the fuck off the island, huh?
But the prince wants the desert to be part of his domain. He wants things brought to heel over there. So you fuckers are gonna go do that. Sort of a vampire dirty dozen, as it were. Things went very badly eventually, and the campaign kind of had to like soft reset, but we will get to that. We will get to that in time. I told the players, you can create whatever kind of vampire you want. You can be like brand new. You can be an elder if you want to. I gave them different point categories that they could take. You just have to come up with a reason why you're in LA right now, and why you're basically like disavowed. Why it is you're someone who they're like, who are like the shittiest vampires we have, who we hate? Those guys. Let's send them to the desert. Why are you being sent to the desert? So our characters were, first of all, Ashley, the psycho Nosferatu who did not wear any clothes. Ashley's player told me, she described her as, I'm going to be Florida Man, but as a vampire. Then we had Stella, Stella Luna, who was a Tremere. Now, the story behind Stella Luna, I went through this in another video in the old campaign, that during the like, what was it, about 80 years that the old campaign covered, the Tremere had been wiped out multiple times. Like 3 or 4 different Tremere chantries were burned down. Multiple Tremere regions died. The Tremere kept getting annihilated over and over again. This player came up with a character who was like some Tremere librarian who had retroactively been among the Tremere for that entire time, had been in the Tremere chantry since the 1920s, and no one had ever seen her because she would just hang out in the library, you know, doing research. But she was like some socially awkward nerd who would sit around and had somehow managed to avoid being killed in any of the instances where the chantry was burned down over and over again, to the point that, partially because she was sort of awkward and annoying and not very useful, and partially because people were starting to think that she was cursed, the Tremere were kind of like kicking her out of the chantry now. Then we have Malin, who is like a death metal musician, also a Tremere. She was from some like European, Scandinavian country, and she had like some falling out where she got into a big fight with her like Tremere sister. They both had the same sire. Some people got killed, and she got kind of exiled from Europe. So she just showed up in LA looking for a place to stay. We have Stas, another Nosferatu. This one who has only been a vampire for like a couple of months. He's brand fucking new. And Stas's backstory is that he is a child of Nathaniel Bordroff. Now, Nathaniel Bordroff is a vampire who the players had briefly encountered in the game. He's a Nosferatu in Chicago who was formerly a vampire hunter, got turned into a Nosferatu, and now as a Nosferatu is actively trying to like undermine and destroy vampire society. Bordroff created him to do hacking work for him. Then he kind of accidentally, as I recall the backstory, accidentally betrayed Nathaniel Bordroff, causing Bordroff to try and kill him. The Prince of Chicago just like sent him to LA, basically like in a witness protection program. Like, I need this Nosferatu for something down the road. I'll just ship him off to LA and ask the Prince take care of this guy. And then finally, we have Emil. I have encountered a lot of players over the years who have brought in characters where they're like, oh, I don't remember my backstory. My character forgot, doesn't know where he came from. And I usually view that as a very annoying red flag situation. The whole idea of Emil was that he was so out of it, so disconnected from what was going on, and so just kind of like rock stupid that it wasn't that he had like amnesia, technically speaking. He just literally didn't know what was going on at all. It was a running joke throughout the entire campaign that Emil didn't really know how old he was. He would say certain things that would imply he had been alive for hundreds of years, and then other things that would imply that he'd only been around for a few decades. They could never figure out, like, was Emil alive in the time of the Old West? Did he come from the 1980s? Like, where did this guy come from? He couldn't drive a car. He didn't know what cell phones were, didn't understand the internet, was not aware of television, didn't fully understand cars. The player playing Emil, she took this usually very stupid concept of like, I'm just a character who doesn't know his backstory, and actually turned that into a backstory that was surprisingly intriguing. Just proof that there is no such thing as a bad story. There's only poorly told stories. Even the stupidest story imaginable, for example, I don't have a story, can still be good if you tell it correctly. So the start of the campaign, these 5 vampires who have never met each other, they're all rounded up, and they're told by Bertram and Jimmius, like, you guys are being assigned to this new coterie by the prince, the dragon, and we're sending you out to the Mojave Desert. If you don't know what the Mojave Desert is like, it's where I grew up, which is why I was going to run this game there, because I know it pretty well.
It's been called the land that God had forsaken, long considered one of the harshest environments on Earth.
The best I can explain it is that we were using Google Maps to look at the Mojave Desert, and at one point one of the players turned Google Maps from like the map view to like the geographic view, and his mind was completely blown when he realized that like 95% of these gigantic maps he was looking at were just barren desert. He was looking at all these streets thinking there were buildings, like in a city, but no, there were no buildings. There are just weeds. It's not exactly a high value territory. And they are told that in the past, there have been a few different like vampire packs that have kind of run things out here, but they're mostly small time. Recently, Stone Tree from the old game was sent out here with the mission to take over this place. And as far as they understand, he's probably dead. They haven't heard from him in quite a while. So it's been about 5-10 years since that happened, and they're trying again. They have another group of people they don't really give a shit about, and they're kicking them out to the desert. The only real direction that they're given is they're given 2 contacts. One, a Nosferatu, who knows everyone and everything about everything that's going on in the city, who they never looked up. They never attempted to contact this Nosferatu the entire time they were out there. The other contact is Adrian Pimento, a vampire who was in the previous campaign, although I don't think I ever mentioned him because he was a pretty minor character, never really did anything that significant. He is this sort of demented Bruja who I just threw in as a comic relief character based on some Jason Mantzoukas characters. He's based on like Adrian Pimento from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and in particular on Rafi from The League.
I'm trying to protect my balls, okay? I'm hoping that you can help me.
Yes, I will be your ballsy guard. From now on, I'm Kevin Costner, your balls are Whitney Houston.
R.I.P.
R.I.P. Whitney Houston?
Yeah.
Oh my God! Whitney's dead?
Yeah.
Oh! How's Michael Jackson taking it?
They never looked up the Nosferatu, who had all the information they needed and could have actually been extremely helpful to them, but they did stay in very close contact with Adrian for this entire campaign. They get together and they drive out there and they find Adrian at the Church of the Flat Earth, which is a weird, creepy little cult in the middle of Lancaster that Adrian has taken over. He's got in there, used his presence powers to just convince these people that he is also a flat earther, and he's unhinged and psychotic enough that they just don't question this at all. The point that the players show up, Adrian is kind of panicking because he owes this scary Russian guy a bunch of money for drugs that he stole, and He then had a bunch of other drugs, a bunch of meth that he was going to sell to make that money back. But the meth was in a taco truck, and the taco truck has vanished. So as soon as the players show up, Adrian immediately asks them, can you please find this taco truck full of drugs so that this Russian doesn't kill me? And they do. They go out, they find a taco truck. This is actually where they meet Malin, because Malin's player wasn't there for the first session. I always have one player who like drops out of the first session at the last minute. Malin's player wasn't there for the first session, so she created her character separately, and then I just told them, like, we already sent this other Tremere out there, so go meet up with her. And then when they went to meet with the Tremere, they met Adrian, who was like, oh yeah, I know the Tremere you're talking about, the player character who's definitely in this game, and eventually we will meet at some point, I'm not sure when. I sent her to find the taco truck, so they went out and they did eventually meet her when she showed up for session 2 at the taco truck. They kill all these guys, these like bikers, who have like a shack and a bunch of bottles of pee and shotguns, and they ambush this taco truck, kill the guys in the taco truck, stole their meth. They get the meth and they bring it back. Through Adrian, they then start setting up like their connection to the city. Adrian, although not nearly as effectively or as meaningfully as the Nosferatu would have, is able to give them some information about what's going on, and is able to introduce them around to most of the major players in the area. They meet a bunch of weirdos. They meet like some strange Malkavian who works in a used bookstore, and they meet like this Giovanni family, who are just the McMahon family from WWE. They spend a lot of time trying to set up a haven, and never really managed to do that successfully. I kept giving them havens, like here's an abandoned building, here's an abandoned building, that they kept rejecting. For some reason, I think just because they saw on the thing that they could take haven at dot 1 and it would be an RV, like 2 of them took this. 3 of them I think took this. And so like Stella Luna had her own RV, and then Staz had an RV, and then Malin had a Winnebago that she was driving around in, which had all of her equipment in it. She was a drummer, so she has an entire drum kit in this Winnebago. So they create like a roving haven. They also had a trailer at one point full of cows, because Stella Luna drank cow blood. And while they did have quite a few little weird adventures, I'm going to focus really, I think, on just 3 stories that are the most interesting impactful. The first one being the story of the ghost house. So early on, they meet this vampire named Sheed. He got embraced by a vampire. He's a Toreador because he was so good at basketball. And then, of course, couldn't be a basketball player anymore because he's now a vampire. And eventually ended up fucking up something and getting like breaking the Masquerade by getting noticed doing weird stuff, and had to like kind of flee out to the middle of nowhere. He's out here trying to figure out something to do with himself. And one of the things he's done, because he has quite a bit of money, his sire gave him a bunch of money, is he decided I should like flip some houses. That's a good way to make money. He bought up some houses and is trying to resell them. Unfortunately, one of these houses is haunted. So he asks the players, can you solve this haunted house thing for me? If you can get rid of the haunted house, or get rid of the ghosts, I can sell it and I'll give you some money, I'll pay you. He's had like contractors up there who have like been struggling to breathe and passed out, got sick. One guy went crazy and started stabbing himself with like an X-Acto knife. They also had a reporter come out and do like a report on it and say, oh, it's a haunted house. And now like one of these ghost hunting TV shows has contacted his lawyer, and they want to do an episode where they come and film the haunted house.
I have a great desire to know the unknowable, to see the unseeable, to understand paralegal activity, aka ghosts.
When they get there, Malin by this point had figured out that she has this power, this Tremere power, where she can talk to wood. And mostly just to annoy me, she would go around and talk to every single fucking tree and piece of wood that she encountered. So we arrive at the house and she goes up and she's like, talk to wood. What is it called? tongue of wood or something. Like, wood speak. Tell me, Mr. Tree, what's going on here? And then she talks to the tree for like 5 minutes, and she's like, okay, I'm done talking to the tree. I walk to the house. Wood speak. Tell me, door, what is going on here? And she just goes to the house talking to every single piece of wood that she can find, asking it what's going on, which was frustrating. As they're exploring around this house, they find some weird stuff. They find like a bunch of turkey basters for some reason in a bucket. They also find outlines on the walls of bodies, like where the paint has sort of like swollen up in the shape of like a body. And then they also find some weird smells in one of the rooms, and they start tearing up the floor because they smell something under the floor. And they find all of these like gasoline containers that are full of some like blue liquid that is really strong smelling, and they don't really know what it is. Stas considers drinking all of this unidentified liquid, but eventually decides against it. They also then wander into the garage, where some of them start choking to death, which is pretty weird because vampires don't breathe, so they can't choke, technically. But as they go into the garage, they become overwhelmed by these weird, like, fog fumes, and they start feeling like they are suffocating until they eventually get out of there. Like, the doors kind of lock in on them, and they manage to break out of this room. Now, a lot of them have auspex, and with auspex, they're able to see that there are a bunch of ghosts in this house, and it looks like a bunch of people got murdered in this house, specifically in that garage, and they're pretty sure that they, like, suffocated in there. But they can't really do anything because they can't talk to the ghosts, and they don't know anything about ghosts. So they figure they need a ghost, some sort of like ghost. What is it I'm thinking of? Ghost breaker. That's what I'm thinking.
Ghost Breakers Incorporated. You make 'em, we shake 'em. Bob Hope speaking.
Now they don't know any ghost breakers, but luckily they did meet one in Vegas. When they first arrived, they were given a job to like deliver something to Vegas, and so they drove out there and they met the vampires who were running Vegas. The main vampire, the Prince of Vegas at this point, is actually Margot, who was from the previous campaign the Chilled of Enzo, the player Enzo, and she has now been elevated up to Prince of Vegas, taking over the like power, that structure that Enzo had established in Vegas in the past. Now that Enzo is dead. But they also meet Tommy Pajamas, who is now out there in Vegas as well, working for the prince. Tommy Pajamas is a Samdi, so he should be able to talk to ghosts. He says no, but he does tell them that he knows another Samdi who does that professionally. She's like a ghost breaker for hire, who he can put them in contact with. And they hire this Samdi, spending a lot of the money that they were going to make from doing this job to pay to fly her out to the desert, put her up at a hotel for a couple of days, and then hire her to come out and do an exorcism. They're able to figure out, or rather the Samdi is able to figure out, that this house was being used by like a drug cartel and also human trafficking group, and at some point something went wrong. She's not sure what, but for some reason they decided they needed to kill these women that they had there. They had this group of women there who were working in the drug processing thing, processing drugs, and they like tied them all up, put them in the garage, and just ran a car in there until they all suffocated from carbon monoxide poisoning, which is why the place is full of these ghosts, because several of the women are now ghosts. So they dig up all of these bodies with the help of the Samdi, rebury them, exorcise the house. They have the little house is clean moment.
This house is clean.
They turn the house back over to Sheed, and the Samdi fucks off back to Las Vegas. I almost said New Vegas. It's just Las Vegas.
I like to call it lost wages.
Nice. Well, the reason that this is important, besides it being a fun little adventure that they went on, is that this is what gets them deeply involved in this guy Sheed and interacting with him a lot. I had specifically mentioned when they talked to Sheed, I had mentioned it a couple of times, that he was, number one, not very good at being a vampire. He was really new and just wasn't really in the mindset yet of how to function within the Masquerade. and that he had already caused some pretty major Masquerade violations in the past. While they are interacting with him, he is being actively hunted, and at a certain point during their interaction with him, being actively watched by the Second Inquisition. The Second Inquisition, which is like a part of the it's part of the 5th edition lore, that sometime after Gehenna, like the government became aware of vampires, and that there is like an active force within the government, primarily I think run through the FBI, which is looking for and hunting down vampires and trying to get rid of them. Now, I didn't specifically sick the Second Inquisition on the players. That'd be a little dickish. Instead, I just put them in contact with the vampire who was being watched by the Second Inquisition, and I left it up to them. How careful are they in the way that they interact with this guy that they don't draw attention to themselves? And the answer was more careful than I had maybe expected, but not quite careful enough. And especially when they start hearing about this like weird self-help group / religious cult that is operating in the area. The Second Inquisition is using essentially as like a honeypot thing to like spread vampire information as a way of trying to alert other vampires to see if other vampires show up thinking this might be a Masquerade violation, and then they can spot them. And it's through She that they become aware of this and then go into one of these meetings where they were reasonably good about not being super obvious about the fact they were vampires, but did draw enough attention to themselves that this eventually led to people following them around. And once they're being followed around, yeah, they're not very good at not doing stuff that is obviously illegal. Like, we've been driving back and forth between these different murder sites. Let's look for cars. Are we being tailed? Like, let's just check for that. Now, I mentioned earlier that they had an entire caravan of RVs. So, after driving back and forth over the course of multiple days to several different sites, which involved mass murders, driving around in this caravan of like 2 RVs, a giant cow trailer, and a Winnebago, which is an extremely conspicuous group of vehicles to be driving around in, and doing all of this at night, and then parking in a Walmart parking lot, which is a very public area with security cameras and people all the time. The FBI agents who were looking for vampires, as soon as they started looking at these guys, very quickly marked them out as vampires. This kind of concluded with a massive hit on them in the Walmart parking lot. They wake up in the middle of a catastrophe. Some of them are on fire, like they are being raided actively by the FBI. I allowed them to escape this situation by just fleeing in chaos. Some of them running into the sewers. So, like, Emil ran off and just like buried himself in the earth. Malin actually charged into somebody's house in like a nearby neighborhood and like massacred the people in this house and hid in their refrigerator. They lost their vehicles. They lost a bunch of equipment. They lost all their money, which really made them much more paranoid from that point on about thinking about stuff like, we should pay attention to whether we're being followed. In the old game, they would complain a lot about like, man, I hate playing in the past. There's no cell phones. There's no internet. Like, this is so annoying. There's never security cameras anywhere because it's like the 1960s. And I would sometimes say to them, like, I don't know that you guys would really prefer playing in an era where there's cell phones, internet, and security cameras everywhere. I think that would be worse for you. And boy, was I right. It was much worse for them. But anyway, that's the story of the ghost house and the Walmart parking lot raid. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in space.
With me, as per always, is my best friend and night vision videographer, Peter Paparazzo.
Yo, I'm not particularly afraid of any specific ghost.
And our deaf mute sound guy, Gian. I mean, this kid always shows up.